In the modern world, people have cut themselves off from spirituality, and it's depressing. A lot of modern technology is the exact opposite of the spiritual principle of be here now. That's not a good model for any society. That's why this book, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, is where I discuss a range of different spiritual practices.
The very beginning of this book, I was almost shocked to hear you talking about sports.
Sports are the yoga of the West. They're the main way in which people in the modern world actually achieve altered states of consciousness, pushing yourself beyond normal limits. That is obviously putting you in the present. Fasting is the simplest way in which we can all enhance that sense of connection.
And what's happening spiritually when you're fasting?
A tremendous spaciousness opens up, which gives an altered state of consciousness.
You go back to psychedelics and cannabis. How do they play out in this book?
These drugs, they tune us into a kind of collective experience and connect us with nature, with animals and plants. Those who have religious and spiritual practices, generally speaking, are healthier and live longer than those that don't. These things can change our lives. We can experience our own mind as being part of something much greater than ourselves.
They say that the human race is doomed, that we have lost touch with our true nature, that the media has corrupted us, and that the planet has no future. I disagree. I believe that humanity is full of hope, and that our salvation lies within each one of us. My name is Brian Rose, and my job is to listen, the oldest method of learning known to man. Each week I seek out individuals that are changing the world, people who are living and thinking in a different way. Their stories will challenge your beliefs, make you question your choices, and perhaps inspire you to change. I never planned on doing any of this, but now I can't stop. Join me on this mission and make humanity something we can all be proud of.
I love Rupert Sheldrake because he's always pushing the envelope of what we think science is all about. And his latest book, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, is him really thinking about some new ideas like fasting, sports, and psychedelics, and how they can really take us to new levels. And I was lucky enough to join Rupert on a pilgrimage throughout the churches of London. And I took my stepdaughter, and we had an incredible day of going through and observing a lot of these spiritual practices that we could use in our everyday life. And I know you're gonna love this episode with Rupert. He's always someone that has had a place in my heart. I've gotten to know him personally over the years, and I just really love everything he's about and everything that he stands for. At Inside London Real, we are working in our academy to transform people from around the world. We have just closed out our Speak to Inspire course, and next is the Business Accelerator. Here's a little bit more about what we do inside our academy.
London Real doesn't stop when the conversation ends. You see, that's when we get started. Because everything begins with a thought, and then comes the action. The London Real Academy is our global transformation platform. Here we bring together thousands of students from over 75 countries. Whether you want to build a profitable business from your passion, or learn to speak to inspire, or broadcast yourself with your very own podcast, or accelerate your life to become a high-performance person, we have the online accountability course and personal mentoring program that will make your dream a reality. Join us, and we'll take your life to the next level, together. Our next accelerator course is starting soon.
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, the biologist and author of more than 85 scientific papers and 14 books, who has been ranked as one of the top 100 global thought leaders. You've studied at both Harvard and Cambridge University and been a research fellow at the Royal Society here in London. Your controversial TED Talk, The Science Delusion, was banned and then re-uploaded by TED and now has over 1.5 million views. And your new book, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, considers 7 spiritual practices that are personally transformative, which have scientifically measurable effects. Rupert, welcome back to London Real.
Good to be here.
It's always a huge pleasure and honor to have you here. I feel some kind of kinship with you, Rupert. I don't know if it's just me or if you have that effect on all sorts of people. And I really appreciate your invitation to the Oriental Club last week for your book launch. So thank you. I appreciate it. And also, I realize now that when you accepted my invitation for Thanksgiving dinner at my house, it was just a research project for you. And that hurt me, Rupert.
It wasn't a research project. I had been to ones in America, actually.
Okay.
But it is one of the things I write about, the observing festivals and rituals. And thank goodness it happens. And it was an honor to go to one in Hampstead.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure having you there. And once I read, Science and Spiritual Practices, I'm looking at my holidays and rituals in a different lens. And I know that's what you're trying to do here, and I want to talk about that. But, we went around the table and everyone talked about what they were thankful for. And, these things that we kind of take for granted, they have a real important place in our lives, don't they?
Yes, certainly do.
Yeah. One thing, the very beginning of this book, I was almost shocked to hear you talking about sports. And I remember last time you were here, I tried to give you a London Real t-shirt, and you said, I don't wear t-shirts. and you said, my son doesn't wear t-shirts. And so I thought a scholar like you would never talk about sports, because it almost seems like the opposite of what you are. But I was obviously completely wrong. And so tell me about sports and why they made kind of top billing in this book.
Well, I didn't write about sports because it's the dominant part of my own life. But, everyone plays sports to some extent, and I don't think of myself as a very high-level sports person. But I enjoy sports, and the ones I've played most are tennis and squash. And what I mainly do in terms of exercise is walking, and that doesn't really count as a sport. But the reason it's there is because sports are such an important part of the modern world. I mean, if you think of the role they play in many people's lives. And I think they're the main way in which people in the modern world actually achieve altered states of consciousness. And it's all totally below the radar. I mean, sports are totally above the radar in the sense it's prime-time television, there's sports pages, sports newspapers.
Jerseys, t-shirts, all that.
All that kind of thing.
Right.
Billions of dollars and all that. But this experiential dimension, which is why a lot of people do them, I mean, some of it's competitive, some of it's professional, but sports include both, amateur team games and professional team games, also ones that are not about competition primarily, but about experience. Skiing, for example. Most people are not skiing because they're trying to win something or make money. In fact, it costs them a lot of money. And then there's all these extreme sports where people are doing things that are really dangerous, the exact opposite of the health and safety culture we live in. I was just intrigued by all this, and martial arts. I at one time did martial arts,
really?
And that brings out the spirit of Aikido.
Oh, really? Okay.
And that
at
brings
Cambridge?
out...
At Cambridge, or what is it?
At Cambridge, yes,
okay.
When I was a graduate student.
Okay.
And that's where the spiritual dimension's most explicit in the Oriental martial arts. But I'm a friend of Michael Murphy, who founded the Esalen Institute in California in 1962. Right. And Michael Murphy is somebody who's, in a sense, the pioneer of the human potential movement. He himself is a very keen sportsman. He wrote a famous book called Golf in the Kingdom, about the mystical side of golf, which has sold over 1 million copies. And he takes the view that sports are the yoga of the West, that in the West, the way in which people experience the greatest discipline in their lives, training, altered states of consciousness, all these are coming about through sports. He also thinks that and I agree with him, that they're at one of the leading edges of human evolution. Because if you think about it, in the 20th and 21st centuries, there's been the invention of a whole new range of sports, hang gliding, snowboarding, skateboarding, paragliding, all sorts of sports. Some of them involve diving in the skydiving, jumping out of planes and plummeting through the air, base jumping, and then of course the ones that go with fast machines like motorcycle racing, sports car racing, and so on. All of these have taken human beings into realms of experience that no human's ever been in before. All of them involve the development of new skills. All of them involve the development of new forms of coordination. New muscle groups are brought together, new skills. And of course, with the ones that involve technologies like skateboards and snowboards, there's been an evolution of the technology as well. So this is in fact one of the most rapidly evolving areas of human experience and human skill. And yet, because most people who write books are academics, and it's completely underneath the radar, when people talk of human evolution, they think usually of technologies like iPhones and the internet, or sort of scientific breakthroughs, quantum theory and that kind of thing. But all these physical skills are usually left out of the picture.
That's very interesting. If you looked at the game of football, and especially the way that it's consumed here in this country, like you said, it's kind of above the radar, but the whole experiential, spiritual side is so below the radar. And again, usually the people writing books, aren't the ones necessarily that are chanting at the games, but that's a massive spiritual practice, isn't it?
Well, I think what it is an experience of bonding. I mean, any team game has, as one of its components, obviously working as a team. And when people work really well as a team, there's levels of intuition come into play, which it's very hard to express in normal language. But one of the things Michael Murphy did, he wrote a book called The Psychic Side of Sports. He interviewed American football players and people in other team games. And when he got them on their own, many of them, when they felt secure and at ease with him, would talk about how they had these altered states of consciousness, how they felt kind of telepathic, they just knew where other people were. Some of it could have been subliminal perception, but they thought there was much more than that going on. The team functioning like a single organism when the game was going well. Yeah. And the other thing they said is, you see, that they never discussed this with their teammates in the locker room, because they'd be thought weird. And yet, most of the members of the team were having these experiences, but couldn't talk to other people about it because of the kind of taboo.
Interesting. And that would make sense if you see the coordination of a British football team or an American football team. I mean, so many moving components, balls flying here and there and people are moving. I mean, it would make sense there's some type of connection that's happening that's not visual.
Yes, there's something going on that's more than visual. And you see, I think there's a telepathic component. Pelé, the famous Brazilian footballer, used to talk about this as if it was a kind of telepathy. He had no problem with saying that kind of thing. Torvill and Dean, the great ice skating duo, a classic duo of ice skaters, used to say we're telepathic on the ice. They just knew how the other would move. I mean, similar things occur in other physical activities like dancing. But I think what we're dealing with in team games is a kind of telepathic element, which people feel, and that sense of strong bonding and connection with others takes you out of yourself, literally. You're part of something bigger than yourself. And I think that watching football games or other sports, if you're part of the crowd and you're supporting your team, especially in a home match, there's this sense of bonding, connection. And when people sing together, like when Liverpool sing You'll Never Walk Alone, there's a kind of group experience which I think people need and want. I mean, we're social animals, and a lot about modern life separates people and individualizes and atomizes the society, but sports are a way in which people can feel that bonding.
Which used to be provided by religion, and then football replaced it to a certain extent.
In some sense, it is a kind of substitute for a kind of bonding, but it's more immediate than religion in the sense that it's to do with being in the present and in the flow, in a greater way, perhaps, than most religious rituals achieve. And one of the things about it is this experience of being in the flow. You have to be in the present. And the aim of many spiritual practices is to come into the present, to switch off the chattering mind. The areas of the brain that are involved in that is the default mode network. These are linked areas of the brain which are to do with ruminations and worries and fears and fantasies and so on, the chattering mind. Yeah. Now, one reason for meditating is to try and reduce that activity, and if you meditate regularly, you can reach the point where this stops, usually for a fairly brief period. But as I learned from one of my friends who's an American businessman, he said when he was at his busiest, his mind was going all the time. He could hardly sleep. His mind was so overexcited. And he tried meditating, didn't work. But he's also a rock climber. And he said by the time he was 50 feet up a rock face, he was completely in the present.
Yeah.
And if you're in the middle of a football game, you know, everything depends on the slight, you know, who's got the ball, where do you go next. You can't be worrying about things, bills you haven't paid, or insults that someone's annoyed you with, or what you ought to have said to someone, or what you're going to do tomorrow. You have to be in the present. And I think it's the easiest, fastest and commonest way in which people in the modern world get into the present and into the flow.
Yeah, I think you're right. I had Stephen Kotler in here, who's the founder of the Flow Genome Project, and he said you can see the athletes in flow when you watch a live sport events, but he said watching them in flow can also get the viewers in flow. And that's why we treasure those live events where it's happening and we see the Olympic athlete or the goal scoring or the UFC fight where Conor McGregor knocks someone out, because we're all, you know, the visualization is almost a substitute for being the athlete, he argued.
Yes, well, I think there's a kind of what are known as mirror neurons. It's a kind of resonant thing. If we see other people doing something, we get into that state. I mean, the most obvious case of this is pornography. I mean, the reason people watch pornography is because they find it exciting, sexually exciting. It's sort of, and you know, in psychology, there was a lot of research on mirror neurons showing how if people watch an action, it affects them in a way that they sort of somehow enter into it. Right. Well, they spent years proving this in psychology laboratories, but I mean, the mere fact of the existence of pornography tells you that. You don't really need to spend years proving it in labs. It's obvious.
Right. And I want to talk about sex as a spiritual practice maybe when we're done with a few of these things, because I'm sure you have some thoughts on that. I just had Jimmy Chin in here, who directed the movie Free Solo, which is this climber, Alex Honnold, who climbed the 3,000-foot face of Yosemite El Capitan with no ropes. It's just been nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary Film. And he is an avid climber. He filmed it and he helped direct the movie. And that's what he said. He said, when I'm up there on that face, I feel ultimately present. That's it. Because he has no choice but to think about everything he's doing there, or it's death. And there's a calmness in that.
Yes. Well, I think that being in the present is a necessary condition for a spiritual experience. It may not be a sufficient one, otherwise everyone who plays football should be spiritually enlightened, and that's clearly not the case. They may have this sense of being in the flow, but then it passes off again and may not connect to something bigger. But for some people, this presence opens the way to a greater presence, the sense that there really is a greater presence, a greater consciousness with which they're connecting. So I think it's a kind of gateway to that, a more mystical experience.
Right. So if people are listening and they can observe the spiritual practice that they do engage in and maybe say, oh, okay, I'm going to that football match, I'm playing in this sport, what I'm really doing is transcending myself, and maybe I can even explore that further and in other ways. I mean, is that what you're trying to do, kind of call attention to some of these practices?
Yes, and also to why I think sports are so interesting, along with dancing and music, which are also dynamic, is that these certainly have a spiritual dimension for a lot of people who do them. A lot of people who do sports say they've had spiritual experiences while they're doing them. So it's not just sort of projecting this onto them. I mean, these are what people actually say. Right. Why that's interesting to me, and if we look at the theoretical side, is here are practices which are all about movement and activity, which seem to have a spiritual dimension. They do have a spiritual dimension. But other spiritual practices, like meditation, are the opposite. They're not about movement or activity. They're about stillness. So we have a range of different spiritual practices, all of which have a spiritual dimension. And that's why, towards the end of the last chapter of this book, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, is where I discuss why they work. How is it that such different things can have a spiritual dimension? But we should leave that till later.
Good, I want to cover that. You know, I did my first Ironman triathlon last year, and I'd never really competed in endurance sports in my life. One of my guests on London Real challenged me to do it on a plant-based diet. We can talk about that later. But I found myself on these long runs through the heath, long swims. I actually swam in the pond, and also these long cycling rides. And I'm telling you, Rupert, when I was on kilometer 23 on these runs, sometimes the tears would start streaming down my face and I would be reliving things from the past and getting really emotional. And it surprised and shocked me that a sport could get me to levels that had previously only been reserved for my psychedelic experiences.
Yes, well, I mean, I've never done anything like that myself, so I'm very interested to hear that. And presumably it's pushing you through. I mean, it's pretty extreme what you've been doing, isn't it? I mean, this is not like just going for a jog on the heath. This is like pushing yourself beyond normal limits. And that is obviously putting you in an altered state of consciousness.
Yeah, but I'm kind of doing it in pursuit of this sport, and everyone else is going to do it on the day, and we're all going to try to finish. And actually, the spirit of Ironman racing is we're all going to finish. They have times, but it's more about everyone finishes. So I'm pushing myself to be something greater, but the sport is, and the competitors are kind of pushing me to show up my best. So
yes,
and then also it just makes me so present. You know, when you just have to get through the next 10 steps without stopping, you know, when you can think of all the reasons in your mind why you should stop and you keep going, it's very spiritual.
Yes. So. It's interesting, isn't it, that in this sort of comfort-based health and safety culture that we live in, that actually so many people are drawn to do things that take you literally outside your comfort zone. I mean, this is very uncomfortable, I'm sure. And, you know, some sports are obviously, especially extreme sports, are very dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, in this latest movie I can mention, Free Solo, I mean, Alex Honnold is up on this rock face, and a lot, like you said, developing really new technology. I mean, he's holding at one point, you've got to see this movie, Rupert, I think it's at the IMAX theater, but he's 2,000 feet up, a granite rock face, and his two thumbs are holding him on there with just a grip of one foot, and he has to do a kung fu kick, which is almost like a jump to another rock face. And, you know, this move with this amount of fear, with no ropes, I mean, that's new technology, right? It's never been done before. And like you said, the sports are kind of the cutting edge, whether that's base jumping or this. It's just the human mind has never had to deal with all these things. It's fascinating. It's also very interesting to live through that experience as a viewer. Even though I know he's going to make it, it's still very captivating, and I find myself very present when I watch that.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Let me continue with some of these other practices, because there's quite a few here. Talk to me about this idea of fasting, because I was surprised to hear that you actually do some pretty serious fasts.
Yes.
I had a guest here recently named Timothy Sheaf who had experimented with fasting and then did a 35-day water fast, which was very controversial. He claimed to get a lot of healing and a lot of clarity, caused me to do a 36-hour water fast, which was small, but I appreciated what was going on there. Why should people think about fasting? What's your experience with fasting?
Well, I've been doing it for more than 30 years, and I do it every year for between 3 and 7 days. It's a water fast.
That's long.
And I do it during Lent because that's the traditional fasting period in the Christian tradition. I usually do it in Holy Week leading up to Easter, which is the most traditional time.
Is this a nice way of reminding us that all of these practices have been around before in religions?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, every religion has fasting. You know, obviously Muslims do in Ramadan. That's food and drink during daylight hours. Yeah. Jewish people have it at Yom Kippur. Hindus have numerous fasts during the course of the year.
So these religions have given us all of this historic collective knowledge, probably built up over 5, 10, 20,000 years, even before they were established religions and took all of our pagan ways. And yet we throw them out the window in this century because religion's not cool anymore. And we throw out all of our practices as well.
Yes, well, I think it's a great shame that people, because these practices, as you say, have been developed over a very long period. And if we look back at the history of fasting, our ancestors who were hunter-gatherers didn't get 3 big meals a day. You know, there were periods in the year when there wasn't much food. And wild animals have periods when they don't get much food. So we've evolved to live without food for periods of time and then have food at other times. The idea of regular food supplies every single day is completely unnatural and very modern. I mean, even in the Middle Ages, even in the 19th century, there were a lot of people who didn't get regular meals every day all through the year. Even in parts of the world today, in agricultural societies, there are. And all living organisms have developed with this intermittent food supply. If you take bacteria, E. coli, the famous bacterium, or yeast cells, and you starve them, they live much longer than if they have constant food. If you take mice and you feed them on alternate days, they live 30% longer than mice that get food every day. There's something about the physiology of our bodies where fasting is a way of detoxifying the system, and it's almost necessary to detoxify our systems. So fasting is the simplest, cheapest, and most easily available way in which we can all improve our health. When I say all, I mean, there are some people who shouldn't fast. I mean, if you're suffering from terminal anorexia, it's not a good recommendation, or if you're very ill, or if you're a child, a growing child. But for most normal adults, I think fasting is enormously beneficial.
And what's happening spiritually when you're fasting? What are the kind of things that's going on in your brain and your energy?
Well, the first day of fasting, you feel hungry, and what goes on for me during the first day is mostly feeling hungry and, you know, to attend, you know, trying to forget about the hunger pangs. It's not very spiritual the first day. And if you've not fasted before, by the end of the first day, you're likely to get a headache, because as the fat is flushed out of your fat cells, a lot of toxins that you've built up over the years are flushed out with it.
Yeah, I remember my day, the first day. Yeah, I reminded myself that I ate mostly for the wrong reasons. It wasn't for nutrition or hunger, it was just for pleasure.
And habit.
And habit, yeah.
Yeah. So by the second day, the hunger pangs get less and the headache wears off if you get one. I mean, I haven't had the headache thing except the first time I did it. Most people get it the first time. Okay. By the third day, you just don't feel very hungry. And what I find then is that there's a tremendous spaciousness opens up. I mean, the day is much longer because you don't have all those meal times. So there's just more time to do things. I find it easier to concentrate. I usually do these fasts when I haven't got lots of traveling or meetings and things. I try and keep the period fairly free so I can be fairly, you know, a restful time. I pray, and I find it easier to pray when I'm fasting. And that's one reason all religions have included fasting, because it makes it easier to pray.
How so?
Easier to concentrate.
Okay.
prayer and meditation and reading. I mean, just concentration becomes easier.
Okay. And you pray every day?
I pray every day, but I notice the difference when I'm fasting.
Okay.
And there's also a lightness and a kind of clarity. When you fast, after the first 12 hours, you're breaking down fat. We've all got huge amounts of fat in our bodies, even people who aren't very fat. Calculations have shown that the average American could walk from New York to Florida on the basis of fat stored in their body without eating anything. I mean, the average American doesn't actually test this theory out, but that's what theoretically should happen. And in one clinical study in Britain, a very fat person in the north of England was put on a clinical fasting diet to try and reduce weight, but also as a research project, and went without food for 342 days and emerged perfectly healthy, in fact, much healthier because it lost a lot of weight. Now, when you're metabolizing fat, the breakdown of the fat gives rise to what are called ketone bodies in the blood, ketosis.
Sure. Acetone,
beta-hydroxybutyric acid, and acetoacetic acid. And beta-hydroxybutyric acid is very closely related to gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA, which is the most important neurotransmitter in the brain.
Right.
And also closely related to gamma-hydroxybutyric acid, GHB, which is a street drug, sometimes used as a date rape drug, gives feelings of euphoria. The point is that fasting is actually changing your blood chemistry and your brain chemistry, changing the amount of neurotransmitters in your brain and actually inducing altered states of consciousness.
Okay. Wow, a lot going on when you just stop eating.
When you stop eating, and most people are terrified of doing it. You know, most doctors don't know much about fasting. It's not part of their curriculum in medical school. And I've talked to doctors about it who've been completely ignorant about the benefits and advantages of fasting. You know, they say, oh, everyone needs a good breakfast or something like that. The people who've really worked on this are the naturopaths. They've pioneered, you know, the medical use of fasting. And again, a lot of doctors and a lot of ordinary people think that, oh, I can't do this, it's dangerous, it's extreme. But the fact is, in the past, most people did it, and the Muslims are the people who show us the best example of this. The entire Muslim community does it, except for people who are sick or traveling or children or pregnant women or whatever. But it's considered normal for everyone. It's not considered something just a tiny minority of extremely religious people do. It's just a normal thing.
What do you recommend people try if they want to do a fast? More than one day, because that way you get into that.
Oh yes,
state.
I mean the first day is the worst. I mean, doing
it wasn't the nicest
you did
day.
the 36-hour one, which is where you get all the pain with none of the pleasure. I mean, it's worth going for more than 36 hours. I'd say 2 to 3 days is a good way to start.
Okay.
And you know, just fix the time in advance when you've got the day. There's that period of time when you can do it, and so put it in the diary so that you haven't got a busy time.
Right, because that can be a little hectic because your blood sugar is low and dealing with a lot of people.
You don't want to have to do that.
Right.
So setting aside a period. That's why Holy Week, which is a period of a devotional practice before Easter, is a good time to do it. In fact, in Christianity and in practically all other religions, feasts like Easter and Christmas are preceded by fasts. And in fact, the Lenten fast is preceded by a feast as well. Shrove Tuesday or Carnival is a feast before a fast, and the fast is a fast before a feast because Easter is a feast. And so doing it, I find in the lead up to Easter works best for me, because I observe Easter and the festival of Easter.
Okay.
And so having block out a period of time, then have water, plenty of water, tea. I drink tea as well. I also take psyllium husks, which are a form of fiber, because I found by experience that if you don't take any fiber, then you can get constipation when you stop fasting. It's hard to get the whole intestines going again.
Okay.
So psyllium husks, P-S-I-L-L-I-U-M, you can get at health food shops in capsules, just a convenient way of taking pure fiber, no nutrition, but it's kind of bulk that keeps the intestinal system working.
Okay.
I usually take multivitamin pills as well, just so I'm not going to, that's probably not necessary. But no food. And then when you break the fast, it's best to break it gradually rather than with some vast meal. I mean, your stomach contracts, you feel less hungry, and just eating small meals is a good way to get back into eating again. But basically it's simple, it's free. Anyone can do it, with accepting those people who would be at danger from doing it.
Right, and there are some places that will charge you a lot of money.
You can pay thousands of pounds to go to a health farm and eat nothing, but you can do it at home for free.
Right. You know, you just said that a lot of these feasts and famines are kind of prescribed in religious teachings, and it just gave me a flashback to when I had Dr. Jordan Peterson here. And he is obviously a big scholar of the Bible and of those stories in the Bible. And at some point, he even asserts that those stories are somehow in our DNA, and that they're not just, you know, a collection of things that are in this one religious text, that they actually reflect who we are as humans. And when you say that these feasts and famines are built into our religious studies, it's almost like there's that medical advice that's built into our religion. And I just wondered what your take was on that, and kind of even some of Jordan's views on religious texts. Because it seems like there's a lot of knowledge there we, again, throw out the window.
Well, it's clear that most religions start from altered states of consciousness, mystical experiences of one kind or another. That's one reason I've written this book about spiritual practices, because practices are about experience. And I think experience is where religions start from. If you look at Moses, he had a vision in the desert of the burning bush, a kind of altered state of consciousness. Things looked very different from normal for him. There are some scholars speculate that he was actually taking he may have been taking a kind of ayahuasca type mixture.
Or DMT or something.
Well, the acacia tree in the Middle East contains DMT, and Syrian rue, Pergamon harmala, from which harmaline comes, contains the other component of ayahuasca, and Syrian rue is still used as a herb.
Okay.
And after the revelation of the tablets of the law, Moses gave instructions for the building of the Ark of the Covenant out of the very kind of acacia which contains DMT. So, you know, I think there are some people get carried away, but this theory is put forward by a professor of psychology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Benny Shannon, who's Jewish, he lives in Israel. He's taken a lot of ayahuasca. He's done a psychological study of it. Anyway, he takes this seriously.
Okay. Have they recreated that potential brew, though, that Moses could have taken, or is this still...
I don't know if he's done that
or
not. I mean, it would be an obvious thing to do, wouldn't it?
Yes.
So whether or not it was based on taking ayahuasca-like substance, he had this altered state of consciousness of the burning bush. Then before Moses had the revelation of the 10 Commandments, he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. So he was in an advanced state of fasting, which gives an altered state of consciousness. Right. The prophet Elijah fasted for 40 days and fasted 40 nights, and again had a kind of visionary qualities. Jesus fasted for 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness after his baptism.
Do you think it was the fasting, or do you think there were also some psychedelic components in some of these things? Because you look at, you know, the prophet and how he envisioned Islam and came out of the desert, a lot of these religions look like some type of psychedelic revelation.
Well, they may or may not have. I think it's unlikely that the prophet, there's no evidence that they were actually taking psychedelics at that period. I mean, the one mind-altering substance that was well known in the Middle East and elsewhere was cannabis. But I wouldn't suggest the prophet was taking cannabis. But the thing is that fasting itself leads to altered states of consciousness, and we know that that's a traditional practice not just in organized religions, but in many shamanic cultures. They have periods of fasting, before undergoing rituals or ceremonies.
Sure.
rites of passage and initiations, the American vision quest, the Native American vision quest for young men, involved fasting and being alone in the wilderness. So it's, Jordan Peterson, I think, is right in saying that these practices like that, which we find all over the world in different religious contexts, are deeply embedded in human nature. And originally, they probably happened through periods of famine, that people would have, whether they liked it or not, had periods of fasting. But they would have noticed the effects and then built it into these practices. So I think these are very deeply rooted in our evolutionary history. As I said earlier, the health benefits of fasting apply to all sorts of animals, even to microbes. So it's just part of animal and biological nature to have these periods of deprivation.
Right. So just, you go back to psychedelics and cannabis. Talk to me about that as far as
Excuse me.
Spiritual practices. I mean, you've had your own experience at Cambridge, I think originally with LSD. I recently had some ayahuasca ceremonies last year that I could talk about that were very, revelatory, to say the least. How do they play out in this book when you talk about those?
Well, what I'm interested here is the use of psychedelics as a spiritual gateway or portal or rite of passage. I think for many people they actually have that role. I think cannabis does as well. Sometimes they're purely recreational. I mean, a lot of people who smoke cannabis at parties are not doing it for a spiritual experience. But traditionally, it has been used in the spiritual context. And as I say in this book, the first time I actually took cannabis, I was in India. I was traveling through India from Cambridge on my way to Malaysia, where I spent a year studying rainforest plants. It was in 1968, an exciting time to be in India.
Why? Why was it exciting?
Well, it was the very height of the flower power. The Beatles had been to see the Maharishi. There were, the war hadn't happened in Afghanistan and places. There were hippies traveling overland through Afghanistan to India. India was full of hippies and groups of people in VW buses and stuff. I mean, this was like a discovery by the counterculture of India. And it was when people were very starry-eyed, here were all the mysteries of the East, and you could go to explore them and so on. I hadn't gone, I was stopped off on my way to Malaysia to do a Royal Society-funded project on rainforest ferns. So I was there.
You weren't on the flower power tip.
I wasn't on a flower power trip, and I hadn't driven across Afghanistan in a battered VW bus. And when I was in Delhi, I ran into the only person I knew in India, by chance, a graduate student friend from Cambridge who was doing an anthropological fieldwork project in a village in the Himalayas. And he said, I'm going to my village, do you want to come? So I said yes, and I delayed my flight and my arrival in Malaysia and went with him up to the village. It was several miles from the nearest roadhead, I mean several hours walk actually, and no electricity. It was, there was simple old style Indian life. He spoke the local language, he knew most people. We went for a walk one afternoon. We walked along a river, a mountain river. There was a cave beside it, and there was this figure in orange robes sitting there with a beard and long hair, the local holy man, Sadhu. And he beckoned to us, and he said to my friend, come. He knew him, and he spoke the language. My friend spoke the language. He invited us to sit down, then he brought out a chillum, and he said to me, have you smoked Shiva's holy plant before? And I said, no, I didn't really know what he meant. And so he did an invocation to the god Shiva, and then showed me how to smoke it and passed me this clay chillum. And it was an incredibly strong cannabis. So I was suddenly blasted into this altered state of consciousness, which were in the midst of the Himalayas with a stream flowing down, this sadhu in orange robes. I'd only been in India 4 or 5 days. It was all utterly exotic. And I had this incredible experience of mind opening, open to the sky, the earth, the mountains, part of nature, connected with everything. It was a real revelatory experience for me. And That was my first experience of cannabis. So the idea that cannabis could have a spiritual dimension right from the beginning of my experience with it has been a very important part of it. You know, I didn't smoke it at a sort of drunken party or something like that for the first time. It was in a sacralized experience.
And do you think that's the way that we should consider using it?
Well, I certainly think that if it's used as a form of spiritual practice, then it's good to do it like that, and it's good to do it in a way that it can have a spiritual benefit.
Right. The Rastafaris, it's very spiritual.
Oh, very spiritual. I mean, many Hindu sadhus, some Muslim fakirs, smoking is part of their practice, and in some Muslim shrines, like the one of Hazrat Bal in Srinagar, Kashmir, when I went there was a whole room full of holy men with beards smoking cannabis, a kind of hall where they gathered.